This is another podcast from Alpha Business Media. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping into something really big, Nepal's incredibly ambitious mega infrastructure projects. If you're fascinated by how nations try to, build their future while dealing with finance, development, global politics, well, this deep dive is definitely for you. We're aiming to peel back the layers here.
Mhm.
Think massive new airports, trans-Himalayan railways that sound almost futuristic, huge hydroelectric plants, all under this banner of Prosperous Nepal, Happy Nepalis. But our mission today is to look beyond that slogan. We want to get into the nitty-gritty of how these multi-billion-dollar decisions are actually made. Who's really calling the shots? Is it sound economics driving this, or is it more about, say, short-term politics? Maybe internal power games, or even geopolitics between the giants next door? And maybe most importantly, what's the real cost for the incredibly fragile Himalayan environment and for the local communities living there? This deep dive should give you a real shortcut to understanding how Nepal's future is being shaped right now for decades ahead.
It's definitely a complex picture. As our sources show, these aren't just about steel and concrete. They're tangled webs of, well, power, money, politics, and they have very real consequences on the ground. Perfect for digging into, really.
Exactly. And to get a handle on it, we have to start with this grand vision Nepal has laid out. This is a country that's been through a lot civil war, a massive earthquake, and now it's really aiming high. These infrastructure projects, officially called national pride projects, they're absolutely central to that ambition. And the scale is just, wow. You've got new international airports like Pokhara. There are these huge plans for highways and railways cutting through the Himalayas, the Kathmandu-Tora Expressway, for instance, and the really ambitious China-Nepal Railway, plus massive hydroelectric power stations. HPP Iran III is a big one. The idea isn't just energy for Nepal itself, but generating enough surplus to actually export power, turning Nepal into an energy player, essentially.
That's right. And the official goals, they sound great. They talk about boosting the economy, creating jobs, making it easier to get around, opening up trade, bringing in tourists. It's all framed as Nepal, seeking real economic independence, finally breaking free from being squeezed between India and China.
It's a powerful story of a nation taking control.
Okay, so let's unpack that vision. Because, yes, it sounds impressive, but our sources really paint a more complicated picture, maybe even a contradictory one sometimes.
Yeah.
It seems like the real story starts when you ask, who's actually designing these plans? Who's making them happen? Because that's where the power dynamics really come into play. When you look at the internal structure for approving and building these things, it's not simple. Our research suggests it's pretty fragmented, actually. And often political interests seem to carry more weight than maybe technical know-how or a solid long-term plan. That's a key point. So at the top level, you have the National Planning Commission, the NPC. Think of them as the main advisory body. They draft the big national plans, like the 15th plan currently, and they're involved in picking these national pride projects, trying to make sure they fit the overall goals. But then, especially when big foreign money gets involved, another major player steps in. Investment Board of Nepal, or IBN. It's supposed to be a kind of single window for investors. They specifically approve large foreign direct investment, anything over 6 billion Nepali rupees, and big hydro projects over 200 megawatts. So for something like Arun 3, the IBN has huge power. And here's where it gets messy. This two-part system, instead of making things smooth, often seems to create bottlenecks. Decisions aren't always consistent. A project might start with the NPC, but then need IBN approval, and maybe even final approval from the cabinet. You end up with multiple places where things can get stuck or changed. And get this, navigating the bureaucracy for just one big project could mean dealing with like 36 different laws, maybe 23 departments, several ministries. It's kind of mind-boggling. A real headache for anyone trying to manage these projects.
Wow, 36 laws, 23 departments. That sounds incredibly tangled. And then you throw in what our sources mentioned about political instability, governments changing frequently. That must just add another layer of chaos, right? Constant shifts in policy, changing priorities, maybe more room for politics to interfere. So with all that, how does anything actually get built efficiently?
Well, that's the crux of it. The system itself, which should ensure good planning and execution, often becomes the source of the problem. It leads to major delays, costs spiraling way over budget, and increased risks of corruption. The sources suggest it's not just about individual officials, it's the structure itself that's fundamentally hindering things.
Right, and faced with this kind of systemic challenge, Nepal took a really unusual step, didn't it? A
Yeah.
controversial one, some might say. They brought in the military, the
Yeah.
development army, as it's sometimes called. The government actually handed over the job of managing the Kathmandu-Turai Expressway, the fast-track project, to the Nepalese army. The official reason given was, well, the army has a reputation for getting tough projects done, especially in difficult terrain, and maybe they're seen as more trustworthy or efficient than some civilian agencies.
It's a fascinating move. But even with the Army in charge, it hasn't been smooth sailing. The completion date for the fast track has slipped quite a bit, from 2021 originally, now looking more like 2027. And the cost has jumped significantly, from around 175 billion rupees up to over 211 billion. It's also important to remember the Army is managing it. They're not actually doing all the building work themselves. That's still done by contractors, including several Chinese companies. Which raises a pretty critical question, when the military takes over a major civilian infrastructure project like this, does it operate with the same level of public scrutiny, the same transparency and accountability you'd expect from a civilian ministry? Or does it become maybe a bit shielded from that kind of oversight? It almost feels like a workaround for deeper governance issues. Okay, so we've looked inside Nepal and the internal decision-making, the politics, the Army's role. But it's clear from the sources this isn't just a domestic story. These huge infrastructure projects, they seem deeply connected to what's happening regionally, even globally. Like infrastructure itself is becoming a tool in, well, big politics. Absolutely. Nepal's location is key here, stuck right between India and China, two massive growing powers. This geography means its infrastructure development inevitably becomes an arena for their competition, their rivalry. You see this most clearly with the competing railway projects. These aren't just about trains. They're literally lines being drawn on the geopolitical map.
It really is a tale of two giants playing out. On one side, you've got the China-Nepal Railway. This is a huge undertaking, technically incredibly difficult, costing billions, maybe $5.5 billion, they estimate. It aims to link the Tibetan Railway line down to Kathmandu. It's a flagship project for China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. And the goal seems clear. Reduce Nepal's reliance on India, pull it closer into China's economic orbit. The engineering challenge alone is massive. Apparently, over 98% of the route in Nepal would be tunnels and bridges through the Himalayas. Then, countering that, you have the India-Nepal Railway. This is a proposed line, maybe costing over $3 billion, running from Raxaul in India up to Kathmandu. And it's pretty widely seen as India's direct response, trying to maintain its historical influence in Nepal as China pushes in.
And here's a detail that's just fascinating and really telling. The track gauges. The Chinese railway uses standard gauge. The Indian one uses broad gauge. Now, that might sound like just a technical detail, but it's almost certainly deliberate. It acts as a physical barrier. It means you can't just run trains straight through Nepal, connecting the two networks seamlessly. It reinforces these separate spheres of influence. It's like geopolitics made concrete, or steel in this case. So yeah, these projects are barometers. China wants a stronger foothold in South Asia, maybe even alternative trade routes. India wants to protect its traditional influence, avoid feeling strategically encircled, and Nepal. Well, its policy of non-alignment gets really tested. Every decision about financing, taking a grant versus a loan, from whom it becomes a major diplomatic statement.
And maybe no project shows the potential pitfalls of these choices, how ambition can meet harsh reality better than the Pokhara International Airport. This one seems like a case study in things going wrong. Built with a big Chinese loan, about $216 million from the Exim Bank, built by a Chinese state company, CAMC, and it's been dogged by controversy.
Yes, that project quickly became a focus for concerns about corruption. Nepal's own Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee, the PAFA, investigated and reported widespread irregularities. They flagged alleged corruption, potentially totaling around 14 billion Nepali rupees. That's what, over $100 million?
A huge amount. And the specifics from that investigation are pretty worrying. Things like significant overpricing the cost somehow jumped from the Nepali Aviation Authority's initial estimate of around $145 million to that final $216 million contract price. Why the big jump? Then there were alleged violations of procedures. The report suggested the contract wasn't awarded through a proper competitive tender, that CAMC seemed favored from the start, and even things like questionable expenses payments supposedly made for work not actually done, like delivering huge amounts of soil for the runway that apparently wasn't needed or used.
And on top of all that, the airport just isn't working economically. Since it opened, it's really struggled to attract international flights. It's nowhere near being financially self-sufficient. They estimate it needs something like 1.5 billion rupees a year just to cover running costs. That's before you even think about paying back the loan. There's an annual interest payment of over $3 million due to China. So naturally, people are worried, could this become a classic debt trap, a huge financial burden for Nepal? But, connecting this back, the issue isn't just the debt itself. It's more like the debt is a symptom of a flawed process. This was a tied loan. That means the money had to be used to hire that specific Chinese contractor, CAMC. It essentially skipped competitive bidding. And it was this lack of competition, maybe combined with not enough oversight from the Nepali side, that created the conditions where allegedly price gouging and corruption could happen. So the focus shifts a bit. It's not just about the lender. It's about the whole structure of the deal and the governance failures that allowed it to happen.
Okay, so we've covered the big picture stuff, the internal politics, the geopolitical games, the murky finances. But these mega projects, they aren't just lines on a map or numbers on a balance sheet. They have real, direct impacts on the ground. And those impacts on people and the environment often seem painful and aren't always captured in the official success stories.
That's absolutely crucial. Forced land acquisition, for example, is a huge source of conflict and delays. Take the Kathmandu-Terai Expressway. Its construction was held up for years right at the beginning in a place called Hokana. Why? Because the local people fiercely resisted giving up their ancestral lands. These lands weren't just fields. They had deep cultural significance, agricultural value passed down generations. People were facing the loss of their history, their livelihoods, for this highway promising national progress. You see similar things with hydropower projects like HBP Aruna-3. There have been repeated protests, big disputes over how much compensation people should get for land needed for the dam, the roads, the power lines. Research often shows that even when compensation is paid, it might not be enough for people to rebuild sustainable lives. Farming families can end up worse off. And the process itself is often criticized. People feel they weren't properly consulted, the land value was unfair, sometimes even allegations of things like forged signatures pop up. It makes you wonder, why are these human costs so often downplayed?
It really highlights how these aren't just social issues on the side. They become major risks to the projects themselves, don't they? The delays in Hokana cost money. The disputes around Arun III needed top-level government intervention. If you don't get that social license to operate from the community, it can be just as damaging as running out of funds. And then, of course, there's the environment. Building these massive projects in the Himalayas, it's one of the most unique and fragile ecosystems on Earth. The environmental risks must be enormous.
They really are. Think about the proposed Nijgad International Airport. Still highly controversial. Why? Because building it would mean clearing a huge area of ancient forest. It's critical wildlife habitat right next to a national park. A massive potential loss. Or the Kathmandu-Terai Highway. We already know tens of thousands of trees have been cut down. Yes, there's supposed to be compensatory planting, but can planting saplings truly replace a mature forest ecosystem? It's questionable. And then you have projects like the China-Nepal Railway or the big hydro dams. Lots of tunneling, major construction in areas that are geologically unstable, prone to earthquakes. That raises serious long-term worries about landslides, the stability of the structures themselves, maybe even disrupting water sources. For projects like Upper Iran, there's also this specific risk of GLOF's glacial lake outburst floods. These lakes are expanding due to climate change, and building major infrastructure downstream is incredibly risky, especially after recent dam failures elsewhere in the region have shown just how devastating these floods can be.
So you have this fundamental clash, it seems. On one hand, the national drive for these big symbolic national pride projects. On the other, the responsibility to protect Nepal's incredible natural heritage. Nijgad Airport really seems to capture that tension perfectly: economic development versus ecological preservation.
And the sources suggest a concerning pattern. Environmental impact assessments, EIAs, might not always be rigorous or independent enough. It feels like the narrative of build, 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 construction-led development is often winning out. But the potential cost could be irreversible environmental damage, changing the very nature of Nepal. These aren't just economic decisions, they're decisions about national values.
So wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway from our deep dive into Nepal's megaprojects? It seems pretty clear that the decision-making isn't this neat, rational process. It's much more of a messy, complex mix of different, often competing forces.
Yeah, that sums it up well. These decisions, which will literally shape Nepal for generations, they emerge from this collision point. You've got the fragmented, politicized domestic system we talked about. You've got the geopolitical agendas of India and China playing out. You have these opaque financial deals where maybe transparency and value for money aren't the top priorities. And then layered on top are the very real social and environmental impacts that often feel like afterthoughts. So just to reiterate those key findings. The domestic governance. Often fragmented, politicized, makes long-term planning hard. The geopolitics means infrastructure becomes a tool for others, maybe not always serving Nepal's best interests first. The financing can lead to deals, like Pokhara showed, that create bad assets, potential corruption risks, and budget burdens. And the social and environmental costs, frequently underestimated, treated as unavoidable consequences rather than critical risks needing careful management.
It really drives home the point that the success of these projects, achieving that prosperous Nepal, happy Nepalis vision, it seems to depend less on engineering skills, pouring the concrete, digging the tunnels, and much, much more on the political will to actually fix the decision-making process itself.
Exactly. Without more transparency, without decisions based on solid evidence and economic analysis, without a genuine commitment to fairness for affected communities and protecting the environment, well, these hugely ambitious projects risk ending up not as gateways to a better future, but as expensive symbols of problems that were never properly addressed. Costly monuments, perhaps, rather than engines of prosperity.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Nepal's complex world of mega infrastructure. We really hope it's given you, our listener, a richer, more detailed understanding of the forces at play in shaping this incredible country. And it does leave us with a pretty significant thought to chew on, doesn't it? What responsibility do the international players, the funders, the partner countries actually have? How much should they push for transparency and accountability in the projects they back, especially when you see risks like potential debt traps or serious environmental harm? And for a nation like Nepal, how do you strike that incredibly difficult balance between the very real, urgent need for development and the equally critical need to protect your unique environment and ensure fairness for your people in the long run? These are tough questions, definitely worth thinking more about. We certainly hope you found this deep dive as insightful as we did putting it together. Please look out for more deep dives from Alpha Business Media coming soon.